The dust in my grandmother's attic was the color of old flour, fine and patient, settling over everything I touched. I had been at it for 2 hours, maybe 3, and my hands carried the ghost of the carriage house, lavender from the drying racks, soil from the seedling trays I'd checked before climbing the stairs. The work downstairs was the kind I could do without thinking, which was how I preferred it these days. I lifted another box from the stack near the dormer window and set it on the floorboards. The cardboard had softened with age, corners gone round as riverstone. Inside, a mess of old church bulletins, a tin of buttons, 3 mason jars with lids rusted shut, the things a woman keeps because she means to sort them someday and never does. Through the window, the harbor lay flat and silver in the late afternoon light. I could see the masts of the sailboats moored along the town dock, tilting slightly with the current, and beyond them, the dark line of the breakwater. I had stood at that railing 100 times as a girl, watching the boats come in, waiting for something I couldn't name. Will had stood there with me once, the summer before everything shifted, and he'd pointed to a sloop with a patched mainsail and said he'd sail it to Block Island if I'd go with him. I'd laughed and said I got seasick in a bathtub. He'd said he'd bring ginger tea. I remembered that. I remembered the way he'd looked at me when he said it, like the answer mattered more than the question. I turned from the window and kept working. The quilts were at the bottom of the last trunk, layered in faded cotton and the faint smell of cedar. My grandmother had made them herself, every stitch by hand, the patterns precise and old-fashioned, wedding rings, log cabins, stars. I lifted the top quilt carefully, and my fingers met something hard beneath it, a box. Small, no bigger than a loaf of bread, and carved from wood that had darkened to the color of strong tea. The lid was fitted with a tiny brass hinge, and along the sides someone had worked a pattern of leaves and vines, the lines worn smooth from handling. I didn't recognize it. I had never seen it before in my life, and I had thought I knew every object in this house. I sat back on my heels and held it in my lap. The hinge resisted, then gave with a soft click. Inside, dried rose petals, pale pink, brittle as old paper, filled the bottom of the box. And on top of them, a letter. The envelope was cream-colored, yellowed at the edges now, the kind of stationery you buy at a drugstore because it's all you can afford. My name was written across the front in ink that had faded to brown. Lena, just that. No last name, no address, as if the writer had assumed it would find me without help. My hand stilled on the lid of the box. I knew that handwriting. I had known it before my eyes even registered the shape of the letters, the slanted L, the small careful E, the way the N trailed off slightly at the end, like a thought left unfinished. Will Hadley. I turned the envelope over. The seal was unbroken. On the back, in the same hand, a date, May 16th, 10 years ago. 10 years. The number sat in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed without noticing. 10 years since he'd left town without a word to me, since I'd walked past his uncle's bookshop on Water Street and seen the lights off and the door locked and no note in the window. 10 years since I'd told myself it didn't matter, that we'd been nothing more than friends, that whatever I'd imagined between us was a thing I'd made up out of loneliness and hope. 10 years of believing he had simply gone and I had simply been someone he could leave. But he had written, and my grandmother had taken this letter and hidden it in a carved wooden box beneath a stack of quilts, and I had never known. I pressed my thumb against the sealed flap. The paper was thin, fragile as a dried leaf. I could open it. I could know, right now, what he'd wanted to say. The thought made my fingers tremble, and I set the envelope down on my knee and stared at it. Outside, a gull called once and was silent. The harbor stayed flat and silver. Nothing moved in the house. My phone buzzed in my back pocket, and the sound was so sudden in the quiet that I flinched. I pulled it out, the screen bright in the dusty light. May, a text, short and casual, the way my sister always wrote when she was delivering news she hadn't decided was news yet. "You'll never guess who's back in town. Will Hadley. Henry's bad off, I guess. He's staying at the house on Water Street." I went through it twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. Will was here. Will was here, in this town, right now, while I sat in my dead grandmother's attic, holding a letter he'd written me a decade ago. A letter my grandmother had hidden. A letter I had never known existed until this moment. I looked down at the envelope in my lap, the date, the unbroken seal, the dried rose petals, still faintly fragrant after all these years, as if they had been waiting for something. I didn't open it, not yet. My hands were not steady enough, and I needed them to be steady for what I was about to take in. Instead, I held the envelope between my palms, as if the paper could tell me something without the words inside it, as if the weight of it could answer the question I hadn't known I'd been carrying for 10 years. Why did you go? And why didn't she want me to know? The harbor light was shifting, the silver giving way to something deeper, the first hint of evening in the sky. I could hear the distant clank of a halyard against a mast, the sound carrying up from the water, like a question asked and asked again. I tucked the letter into the pocket of my jacket, and I left the box on the floorboards, and I stood for a long moment at the window, looking out at the boats I had watched all my life, and I let the questions settle around me, quiet and patient as the dust. The Saturday market had its own particular music, and I knew it by heart before I ever set foot on the green. The low rumble of pickup trucks on gravel, tailgates dropping one after another like a sequence of notes. The snap of canvas as tents went up, the clatter of wooden crates stacked too fast, the first calls of vendors who'd known each other 20 years and still argued over who got the corner spot by the elm. I'd been running this market for 6 seasons now, and the rhythm of it had become the closest thing I had to a clock that didn't tick toward anything I was afraid of. I pulled into my usual space just after 6, the sky still holding that gray that hadn't decided whether it wanted to be morning. The peonies were at their peak, heavy-headed and ridiculous, the kind of pink that made people stop and say something they hadn't planned to. I'd cut them the night before, working past dusk in the garden behind the house, because I'd needed something to do with my hands that wasn't holding that envelope. The letter had stayed in the pocket of my jacket for 6 days, not the same jacket. I'd moved it. That was the kind of detail I noticed now, the kind I'd have laughed at 10 years ago. I'd carried it from the attic in my canvas work coat, and then I'd transferred it to the pocket of my market apron, and then I'd set it on the kitchen table while I made coffee, and then I'd put it back in the apron because I couldn't stand to have it in a room where I wasn't. It was still sealed. The paper had softened at the edges from the humidity of too many mornings spent near my body. I hadn't opened it. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but the truth was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid of what 10 years of silence would sound like when it broke. May's text from the night of the attic had been the first I'd heard of Will's return. Will Hadley's back, staying at the house on Water Street. Henry's sick. 3 sentences, and I'd gone through them 17 times before I put the phone down. She hadn't mentioned the letter because I hadn't told her about it. I hadn't told anyone. Some secrets you carry because they're too heavy to hand off, and some you carry because you're not ready to hear what someone else would say about them. I set the rosemary bundles out first because rosemary was easy. It didn't wilt if you looked at it wrong, and the scent grounded me, sharp and clean, the kind of smell that belonged to the present tense. A few of the other vendors waved as they passed. Tom from the dairy farm called something about the weather. I answered without hearing myself. My hands moved through the setup the way they always did, muscle memory doing the work while my mind circled the same 3 questions it had been circling since I'd stood at the attic window with the harbor light fading into evening. Why did you go? And why didn't she want me to know? And the third one, the one I didn't let myself finish, what happens now that you're back? I was arranging the last of the peonies in the blue enamel bucket when I looked up and saw him. He was standing near the Congregational church, the white steeple rising behind him like something out of a postcard I'd seen too many times to trust. He was talking to an elderly couple I recognized from the winter market, the kind of people who came for the honey and stayed for the conversation. His back was half turned to me, but I knew the shape of him before my mind had time to name it. The shoulders, the way he held his head, the slight tilt that meant he was listening and not just waiting for his turn to speak. 10 years, and my body recognized him before my brain caught up. He turned, not because I'd called out or made a sound, but the way people turn when they feel someone's attention on them, that old instinct that hasn't figured out modern life yet. His eyes found mine across the green, past the crates of lettuce and the jars of honey and the woman selling sourdough who was, at that exact moment, telling someone about her starter. The distance between us was maybe 40 feet, but it felt like the space between two notes in a song I'd forgotten the words to. He looked older, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that added something. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and there was a stillness in his expression that hadn't been there when we were 27 and 26 and still pretending we had all the time in the world. His hair was the same dark brown, cut shorter now, more practical. He wore a gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up, and his hands were in his pockets, and for a long moment neither of us moved. Then he lifted one hand, a small gesture, not quite a wave, an acknowledgement. I see you. I know you see me. We're in this now. I lifted my hand in return, and the motion felt like something I'd rehearsed without knowing it. He said something to the elderly couple, a quick goodbye, and then he was walking toward me, and I was standing behind my stall with a bundle of rosemary in one hand and no idea what to do with the other. Lena, he said my name the way someone says a word they've practiced in an empty room. Not too much weight on it, not too little, just the 2 syllables, and then he stopped on the other side of my table and the peonies were between us, and I was grateful for that in a way that surprised me. Will, I set the rosemary down. I heard you were back. May told you. May tells me most things. He smiled, and it was almost the smile I remembered, almost. There was something at the edges of it that didn't quite commit, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. She always did. How are you? I'm fine. The word came out too fast, the way it always did when it wasn't true. Busy with the market. You know how Saturdays are. I remember. He looked around at the green, the tents, the crates. It's good to see this still going. You've kept it running. Someone had to. I hadn't meant it to sound like an accusation, but the words landed between us with an edge I hadn't planned. He didn't flinch. He just nodded, and his eyes met mine again, and I saw something there I couldn't name. Not guilt, exactly. Something closer to recognition. Like he'd been waiting for me to say it, and now that I had, we could both stop pretending. Henry's been asking about you, he said. He wanted me to tell you he's sorry he hasn't made it down to the market. He's not supposed to be on his feet much yet. How is he? Better than he was. It was a rough winter, pneumonia, and then complications. He paused, and I watched him choose his next words carefully. He's the reason I came back. He needed someone at the house, and there wasn't anyone else. I nodded. I'd known Henry Hadley my whole life. He'd run the bookshop on Water Street for 40 years before his health started slipping, and he'd been the kind of man who remembered your name and your favorite author and asked about both every time he saw you. The thought of him alone in that house, with its narrow stairs and its drafty windows and its shelves that smelled of old paper, made something in my chest tighten. Tell him I'll bring him some of the rosemary, I said. It's good for tea. May swears by it. I'll tell him. Will's hands were still in his pockets. He hadn't moved to touch anything on the table, hadn't reached for a flower or a bundle of herbs the way most people did when they stood at a stall. He was keeping a distance, and I noticed it, and I didn't know whether to be grateful or disappointed. He'd like to see you, if you have time. I might. The words hung there. I might. Not yes, not no. The kind of answer you give when you're not ready to commit to anything that might lead to something else. A woman approached the stall, one of my regulars, and I turned to her with a relief that felt too obvious. She wanted peonies, the white ones, and I wrapped them in brown paper while she talked about her daughter's graduation. I answered in the right places. I made change. I smiled. All of it automatic, all of it with the awareness of Will standing 3 feet away, waiting. When the woman left, he hadn't moved. "I should let you get back to it," he said. "There's always more to set up." "Lena." He said my name again, and this time there was something in it that made me stop. "It's good to see you. I know that's a simple thing to say, but I mean it." I looked at him, at the gray sweater and the pushed-up sleeves, and the eyes that were, in this light, the same color as the harbor on a clear day. I wanted to ask him a dozen things. Where did you go? Why didn't you say goodbye? Did you know my grandmother took your letter? Did you know I've been carrying it around for 6 days like a wound that hasn't decided whether to heal? But the market was filling up around us, and the moment wasn't right, and maybe I was still too afraid of the answers. "It's good to see you too," I said, and I meant it, and that was the worst part. He nodded once, and then he turned and walked back toward the church, and I watched him go. I watched the way he moved through the crowd, the way he stopped to say something to the woman selling honey, the way he didn't look back. And when he was gone, I reached for the forget-me-nots without thinking, the small blue blossoms that had been in the back of the crate, and I started arranging them in a mason jar, and my hands were not quite steady. The harbor was just visible from where I stood, a sliver of water between the buildings, the morning light turning it to something that looked like hammered silver. I thought about the letter in my apron pocket. I thought about the way Will had said my name, the careful weight of it, the years packed into 2 syllables. I thought about the promises I'd made myself when I came back to this town after the marriage that had never fit, that I was done with longing, that I'd made peace with the past, that I didn't need answers to questions I'd stopped asking. The forget-me-nots were small and blue and impossibly delicate, and I arranged them one stem at a time, and I knew, with a certainty that settled into me like the cold from the harbor wind, that none of those promises were going to hold. The bookshop smelled of old paper and something deeper, something I couldn't name but recognized anyway. It was the same smell I remembered from being 12 years old and hiding in the back aisles while my grandmother argued with Henry about the price of a first edition. I hadn't thought about that in years. Will was at the front counter when I pushed open the door, a stack of inventory sheets spread in front of him, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked up and didn't seem surprised to see me. "May said you'd probably come by today." May said that, did she? She might have mentioned it. I set my bag on the counter and didn't pursue the subject. My sister had been mentioning things with a frequency that was starting to feel less like sisterly concern and more like a campaign. 3 days ago, she'd appeared at my stall with 2 cups of coffee and a question about whether I'd seen Will at the market again. I'd told her no, and she'd nodded in a way that suggested she already knew the answer and was just checking to see if I'd lie. "Henry's napping in the back," Will said. "He's been doing that more. The doctor says it's normal, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. I understood the shape of what he wasn't saying. Henry had been the anchor of this bookshop for 40 years, and now he was in a back room with a quilt pulled to his chin, and Will was at the front counter trying to make sense of a system that had never been written down. "What do you need help with?" I asked. "The local history section." Henry kept it organized by town, then by year, then by some system I can't figure out. Boxes of it came in from an estate sale last month, and they're still in the back hallway. He gestured toward the narrow corridor behind the counter. "I thought if you had time." "I have time." The words came out faster than I'd meant them to. We worked side by side for the better part of an hour. The boxes were heavy with hardcovers, their spines cracked and faded, and I shelved them by town while Will called titles aloud from the inventory sheet. Our hands brushed once when I reached for a book he was holding, and I pulled back too quickly, and neither of us mentioned it. The afternoon light came through the front windows in long, dusty columns, and the quiet between us was not uncomfortable. It was something else. "This one's mislabeled," I said, pulling a thin volume from the box. It says Mystic, but it's Stonington. The photographs are all of the borough. I opened the book to check the publication page, and something slipped from between the leaves and landed face down on the floor. Will bent to pick it up before I could. He turned it over and went still. "What is it?" He handed it to me without speaking. The photograph was faded, the colors gone soft at the edges, but the image was clear enough. Two people stood at the harbor railing, the water behind them a pale summer blue. The girl was me, younger, 22 or 23, my hair longer than I wore it now, my face turned toward the boy beside her. The boy was Will, and he was, and I was too, and neither of us was looking at the camera. We were looking at each other. I couldn't remember who had taken the picture. I couldn't remember the day it was taken, but I knew the feeling in it, the particular weightlessness of being young and certain that the person beside you was the only person who mattered. "I didn't know this was here," I said. "Neither did I." Will's voice was quiet. "It must have been tucked in that book for years." I set the photograph on the counter between us. My hand stayed on it a moment longer than necessary. "We looked happy," I said. "We were happy." The past tense landed between us and stayed there. Will didn't look away from the photograph, but something in his face had shifted, the careful neutrality giving way to something rawer. "I have coffee," he said after a moment. "Thermos in the back. Do you want some?" "Yes." He disappeared into the back hallway and returned with two ceramic mugs, the kind that had probably been in the shop for decades. Their glaze crackled from years of use. He poured the coffee and handed me one, and we sat on the two wooden stools behind the counter, the photograph still on the counter between us. "I missed this," I said. The words came out before I'd decided to say them. Not the bookshop, not specifically, just the way we were. The way we could talk about anything, and it didn't feel like there was a weight attached to every sentence. Will wrapped both hands around his mug. He didn't drink from it, he just held it, and I watched him choose his words carefully. "Leaving was harder than I thought it would be," he said, "every day, for a long time." He didn't say why he'd left. He didn't say what had made him go without a word, without a letter, without anything but the sudden absence that I'd spent 10 years learning to live around. But the fact that he said anything at all felt like a door opening a crack. "You never called," I said. It wasn't an accusation. I said it quietly, and I kept my eyes on the photograph. I know. I thought I'd done something wrong. For a long time I thought that. Will set his mug down. His hand moved toward the photograph and stopped, and I saw him make the decision not to touch it. "You didn't do anything wrong. You need to know that. Whatever else you don't know yet, you need to know that it wasn't you." The word "yet" hung in the air. He'd said whatever else you don't know yet, and I heard the promise in it, the acknowledgement that there were things he hadn't told me and things I hadn't asked. The letter was in my bag, still sealed, still unread, and I thought about pulling it out and laying it on the counter beside the photograph. I didn't. The moment wasn't right, or I wasn't ready, or both. "I built a whole life around being fine," I said, after I came back. After the marriage ended, I told myself I was fine, and I ran the market, and I grew my flowers, and I didn't ask questions about the past because I thought the past was done with me. And now I'm not so sure. Will looked at me, and the expression on his face was something I hadn't seen in 10 years. It was the way he used to look at me when we were young and he was about to say something that mattered. He didn't say it now, he just looked, and I let him. From the back room, I heard the creak of a bed frame, the shuffle of Henry adjusting his blankets. The sound reminded me that we were not alone in the building, that there was an old man in the back who had kept this shop running for 40 years and who had never once mentioned to me that my grandmother had hidden a letter in her attic. I wondered what Henry knew. I wondered if he'd known all along. "I should go," I said, though I didn't want to go. "The market opens tomorrow. I have to prep the stems." Will stood when I stood. He picked up the photograph and held it out to me. "You should keep this. It's yours." I took it. My fingers brushed his, and this time I didn't pull back. "Thank you for the coffee," I said. "Lena." I stopped at the door. "I'm glad you came today," he said. "I know this is strange. I know there's a lot we haven't talked about, but I'm glad you came." I nodded. I couldn't find words that felt right, so I didn't try. I pushed open the door and stepped out onto Water Street, where the afternoon light had turned the harbor to something that looked like polished metal, and I walked toward my car with the photograph in my hand and the letter still in my bag, and the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. May was at her boutique when I passed, and she saw me through the window and raised a hand in a small wave. I waved back, and I saw her smile, and I knew she'd been right about everything she hadn't said aloud. The carriage house smelled of thyme and old wood, and, tonight, of the coffee I had made too strong and let cool on the counter while I waited. I had set the letter on the table by the window, the cream-colored envelope with my name in his handwriting, and I had not touched it since I placed it there. 4 days since the bookshop. 4 days of turning the photograph over on my nightstand and not calling him and not throwing the letter away and not doing anything at all except running the market and watering the herbs and pretending I was the same woman who had woken up on Saturday morning with her life still sealed shut. May had called at 4. "Just checking in," she said, and her voice was too light, the way it got when she was steering towards something she did not want to name. "You're a terrible liar." "I know." She paused. "Have you talked to him?" "No, Lena, I know." She did not push after that. She asked if I had enough lavender for the weekend and told me the woman who sold sourdough was looking for a new tent, and then she said, "You'll know when it's time," and hung up before I could tell her she was wrong about that too. But I had stood in the kitchen for a long minute after the call ended, and then I had picked up my phone and texted Will an address and a time and nothing else. No explanation, no preamble, just the facts of where I lived and when to come, and the quiet terror of having sent it at all. Now it was dusk, and the harbor was doing what it always did at this hour, pulling the last light into itself until the water looked like something you could reach into and never touch bottom. I watched it through the window and tried not to think about the photograph in my nightstand drawer. The two of us younger and unguarded, standing at the water's edge with no idea what was coming. The knock was 2 raps, firm but not loud, the kind a person makes when they are not sure they are welcome. I opened the door. Will stood on the stone step with his hands in his jacket pockets and his hair a little damp from the evening mist coming off the water, and he looked at me the way he had looked at me in the bookshop 4 days ago, like I was something he had been trying to see clearly for a decade and still could not quite bring into focus. "You came," I said. "You asked." I stepped back and let him in. He moved through the doorway and stopped just inside, taking in the low ceiling and the exposed beams and the shelves of dried herbs and glass jars, the whole small world I had built for myself in the years after I came home. His gaze landed on the table by the window, on the letter. I saw him register it. His shoulders went still, the particular stillness of a man who has just recognized something he thought was lost. "That's my handwriting," he said. "Yes." He did not move toward it. He stood where he was, and I stood by the door, and the space between us felt like the whole length of Water Street, like the 10 years we had not spoken, like every assumption I had ever made about what had happened and why. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "My grandmother's attic, 6 days ago." I kept my voice even, but I could hear the edges where it wanted to crack. "She never gave it to me." He turned then, and his face was not guarded the way it had been at the market or in the bookshop. It was open in a way that looked almost painful, like a door that had been stuck shut for years and forced wide all at once. "Lena," my name, the way he had said it on Saturday, like he was practicing it in an empty room. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know she kept it." "You wrote it." "Yes. And then you left." He did not look away. "And then I left." I crossed to the table and picked up the envelope. My fingers were steady, which surprised me. I had expected them to shake. "It's dated May 16th, 10 years ago, 3 days before you disappeared." I held it out to him. What did it say? He took the letter, and his hand brushed mine, and I did not pull away. He looked at the envelope for a long moment, at his own name written in the corner, at the seal that had held for a decade until my grandmother's death, and my own restless need to clear out the past had broken it open. "It said I was in love with you," he said. "It said I had been in love with you for 2 years, and I had never found the right way to tell you, and I was leaving town because my uncle was sick, and I didn't know how long I'd be gone, or what I'd find when I got there, but I needed you to know before I went. I needed you to know that I wasn't walking away from you, that I would come back if I could, that I wanted to come back." The room was very quiet. Outside, the harbor had gone from silver to something darker, the color of slate after rain. "Henry," I said. "He collapsed the week before. Pneumonia that turned into something worse. The doctors didn't know if he'd make it through the month." Will turned the envelope over in his hands. "He raised me. My parents were gone by the time I was 12. He was all I had, and he was in a hospital in Rhode Island, and I couldn't tell anyone. He made me promise. He didn't want the town to know how bad it was. He didn't want people showing up at the shop with casseroles and pity. He was a private man. So you just left. I wrote you that letter. I put it in your grandmother's mailbox myself because I knew you were staying with her that summer, and I thought." He stopped. I watched him try to find the next words and fail. "I thought you'd get it. I thought you'd open it and understand why I couldn't say goodbye in person. I thought you'd know I was coming back. I never got it. No." His voice was rough now, the careful composure gone. "You never got it." I turned to the window because I could not look at him and feel what I was feeling at the same time. The harbor was nearly dark, the last light a thin line at the horizon, and I thought about my grandmother, about the way she had looked at me that summer when I asked if Will had stopped by before he left, the way she had said no, "Dear, I don't think so," with her hands folded in her lap and her face perfectly smooth. I thought about the 10 years I had spent believing I was not worth an explanation. I thought about the marriage I had walked into because I had stopped believing in the kind of love that waited for you to come back. "She hid it," I said. "She took it out of the mailbox and she put it in that box with the rose petals, and she never told me." "Why?" I shook my head. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure it out for 6 days, and I don't." I stopped. My throat was tight. She didn't want me to leave. She thought the harbor's edge was where I belonged. She thought I should stay here and marry someone local and build a life she could see from her front porch. I pressed my palm against the window frame. The wood was cool and solid. And I did, not the marrying someone local part, but the rest. I stayed. I built a life. I told myself it was enough. We'll set the letter down on the table. He did it carefully, the way you set down something that might break if you held it too long. "I came back," he said, 3 months later, when Henry was out of the woods. "I came back and I looked for you, but you were gone. Someone said you'd moved to Massachusetts. Someone else said you were engaged. I was. I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I figured you'd opened the letter and decided it wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough, that you'd moved on." I turned from the window. "I never opened it. I moved on because I thought you'd left without a word. I thought I'd imagined everything between us. I thought I was the kind of person people walked away from." He flinched. It was small, a tightening at the corner of his mouth, but I saw it. "You weren't," he said. "You aren't." The words hung in the air between us. I did not know what to do with them. I had spent 10 years building a life around the absence of those words, and now they were here, in my kitchen, in his voice, and I had no place to put them. "What do you want from me, Will?" I asked. "You're back. You're here. You're staying in your uncle's house and working in his shop, and you keep showing up at the market and looking at me like—" I stopped. I did not know how to finish the sentence. "Like I never stopped," he said. "Like you never stopped." I didn't. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, he was still there, still standing in my kitchen with the harbor dark behind him and the letter on the table and his hands at his sides like he did not know what to do with them either. "I don't know how to do this," I said. "I don't know how to believe you. I don't know how to trust that you're not going to disappear again the next time something goes wrong. I don't know how to separate what you're telling me now from what I told myself for 10 years. I'm not asking you to know." He took a step toward me, just one, and stopped. "I'm asking you to let me tell you the truth, all of it, whatever you want to know, whatever you need to hear." I looked at him, at the man who had been a boy I loved, and a memory I buried, and a question I had stopped asking, and I saw the thing I had not let myself see at the market, or in the bookshop, or in any of the long nights I had spent turning the letter over in my hands. He was not here to explain himself and leave again. He was here because he had never wanted to leave in the first place. "Tell me about Henry," I said. "Tell me why it had to be a secret." He nodded. He pulled out a chair from the table, the one I had painted pale blue the summer I moved in, and he sat down, and I sat across from him, and a letter lay between us like something that had finally stopped being a wall and started being a door. "He was all I had," Will said again. "My parents died when I was a kid, car accident. Henry took me in. He was a bookseller, not a father. He didn't know how to raise a 12-year-old, but he did it anyway. He gave me the apartment above the shop and a job after school and every book I ever asked for. When he got sick, he asked me for one thing: don't let the town see me like this. Don't let them treat me like a tragedy. So you honored it. I honored it, and I lost you." He looked down at his hands. "I thought the letter would be enough. I thought if I could just get the words on paper, if I could just tell you what I felt and why I was leaving, you'd understand, you'd wait." I would have. He looked up. "If I'd opened it," I said, and my voice broke on the last word, just a little, just enough that I knew he heard it. "I would have waited. I would have understood. I would have." I stopped. I pressed my fingers against the tabletop. I spent 10 years thinking I wasn't worth an explanation. I built a whole life around that. I married a man I didn't love because I thought the kind of love I wanted didn't exist. I came back here and I ran the market and I grew my herbs and I told myself I was fine. I told myself I was content, and the whole time, you had written me a letter that said I'm coming back. Will reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His palm was warm and rough at the edges, a bookseller's hands, a man who had spent years handling paper and spines and the worn covers of things other people had discarded. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't try harder. I'm sorry I didn't find another way. I'm sorry I believed one letter was enough when I should have made sure you heard me." I did not pull my hand away. The harbor was fully dark now, the window a sheet of black glass with the faintest reflection of the two of us bent toward each other across the table. "I don't know what happens next," I said. "Neither do I. I don't know if I can." I stopped. I did not know the right word. Trust, believe, forgive. None of them felt large enough for what I was being asked to do. "I don't know if I can let myself want this again." "Then don't," he said. "Not yet. Not until you're ready. Just let me be here. Let me tell you the rest of it. Let me show you that I'm not going anywhere this time." I looked at our hands on the table, his covering mine, and I thought about the photograph in my nightstand, the two of us at 26 and 27, with the harbor behind us and no idea what we were about to lose. I thought about my grandmother, about the box in the attic, about the dried rose petals she had saved for reasons I would never understand. I thought about the life I had built, the quiet, contained life that had felt like a choice until tonight, until this moment, until the truth of what had been taken from me made it feel like something else entirely. "You asked me once," I said, at the bookshop, if I ever thought about leaving, about what was beyond the harbor's edge. "You said you'd made your peace with staying." I did. I thought I did. I turned my hand under his, just enough that our palms met, but I don't know anymore. I don't know if I made peace or if I just stopped asking the question. He did not answer. He did not need to. He sat across from me in the kitchen of the carriage house I had made into a life, and he held my hand, and outside the harbor had gone dark, and the first lights were coming on along Water Street, small pinpricks of gold against the black water, and I understood, finally, what the letter had been trying to tell me. Not that he was coming back, not that he loved me, but that I had been right, all those years ago, to believe that what was between us was real, that I had not imagined it, that I had never been the kind of person people walked away from. I had just been the kind of person whose grandmother stole her mail. The thought was so sudden and so absurd and so painfully true that I almost laughed, and then I didn't laugh, because the grief was still there underneath it, the decade of lost time, the marriage I had settled for, the life I had built on a foundation of silence. But the grief had company now. It had Will's hand on mine, and Will's voice in my kitchen, and the truth, finally, after 10 years of not knowing. "Stay," I said, "for a little while. I'll make more coffee." He nodded. He did not let go of my hand. Outside, the harbor held the dark the way it had always held everything, the promises and the losses and the long quiet years between them, and I let myself sit in the presence of what I had finally learned and not yet decided what to do with. The letter had been a question for 10 years. Now it was an answer. The rest would have to be something else. The last of the market had cleared out an hour ago. I'd watched the sourdough woman fold her tables and the elderly couple linger by the honey stall, and now the green was nearly empty, the late September light slanting low and golden across the grass. I was bundling dried lavender with twine, working by feel because my mind was elsewhere, still turning over the same 3 sentences Will had spoken 3 nights ago in my kitchen. "I wrote you a letter. I left it in your grandmother's mailbox. I thought you'd seen it." The words had rewired something in me. For 10 years I'd believed I was the one who'd been silent, the one who'd let something precious slip through my fingers without ever reaching for it. But I hadn't been silent. I'd been kept in the dark by someone who decided she knew better what I deserved. I set the last bundle in the crate and brushed the lavender dust from my palms. The stall was almost packed down. My apron was stained with earth and pollen, and the air smelled of the last of the season's chamomile. I was reaching for the canvas tarp when my fingers stopped. There was a box on the corner of the stall, small, intricately carved, wood the color of honey. I knew it instantly because I'd held its twin in my hands 6 days ago in the attic of my grandmother's house, and my fingers had trembled then the way they were trembling now. I didn't open it right away. I stood there with the market emptying behind me and the gulls crying over the harbor and my own heartbeat in my ears. The box was unsealed. The lid sat slightly ajar, as though whoever had left it wanted me to know there was nothing hidden this time. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, cream-colored like the first one, his handwriting like the first one. I sat down on the stool behind my stall and took it in. "Lena, 3 days ago you let me into your home, and you let me tell you the truth, and I've been trying to find the right words since. I don't know if there are right words for 10 years of lost time, but I know this. I have loved you since I was 27 years old, and I have never stopped. Not when I was sitting in a hospital room in Rhode Island, not when I was rebuilding the bookshop after Henry came home, not when I told myself you'd moved on, and I should too. I didn't move on. I just moved through days that didn't have you in them. I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm not asking you to pretend your grandmother didn't do what she did. I'm asking you to let me be in your life now, in whatever way you'll have me. I'm asking you to believe that what I wrote 10 years ago was true, and what I'm writing now is true, and that I will spend however long it takes proving it to you. I'll be at the harbor at sunset, if you want to talk, if you want to start. Will." I went through it twice. Then I went through it a 3rd time, and on the 3rd pass my eyes stopped on the line about moving through days that didn't have me in them, because I knew exactly what that felt like. I'd done it for a decade. I'd built a whole life around the absence of someone I'd never stopped loving, and I'd called it contentment, because calling it anything else would have been too hard. May's voice came back to me then. She'd called that morning, and I'd told her about the letter, about the confession, about the way Will had sat at my kitchen table and let me ask every question I'd been carrying. She'd been quiet for a long moment, and then she'd said, the waterfront was quiet. The boats were in their slips, rocking gently on the tide, and the sky was doing what it does in late September over the Sound, bleeding from gold into rose, into a deep, bruising violet, and he was there. He was standing with his back to me, looking out at the water, and I stopped at the edge of the pier because I needed one breath, just one, to take in the fact that he'd written me a second letter, that he'd carved a second box, that he'd come down here to wait without knowing whether I'd follow. He turned before I spoke, as though he'd felt me there, as though some part of him had been listening for my footsteps for 10 years. You came, he said. I held up the letter. My hand was shaking. You wrote. I should have written sooner. You wrote 10 years ago. That was soon enough. I just didn't get to see it. He took a step toward me, and then another, and then we were close enough that I could see the way the sunset was catching in his eyes, the way his jaw was set with the same careful hope I could feel in my own chest. I meant what I said in the letter, both letters. I've loved you since I was 27. I love you now. I don't expect that to fix anything, but I need you to know it's not a question for me. It hasn't ever been a question. I know, I said, and I did. That was the thing. I'd known it in the attic when I'd found the first letter, and I'd known it in my kitchen when he'd told me about Henry, and I'd known it every day for 10 years, even when I was trying not to. I've carried this quiet certainty for so long that I walked away from something that mattered, that I let it go without fighting for it, and I've been telling myself that was just how the story ended, but it wasn't. It was just how the silence started. Then let's end the silence, he said. His voice was rough, the way it had been in my kitchen, the way it gets when a man is holding back tears. I'm not going anywhere, Lena. Henry's here, the shop's here, I'm here, and I want to be here with you, if you'll let me. I didn't answer with words. I stepped forward and I put my arms around him, and I felt his arms come around me, and we stood there on the pier, with the water moving beneath us, and the sky going dark above us, and the weight of 10 years lifting so slowly, so gradually, that I almost didn't recognize the feeling. It was relief. It was hope. It was the thing I'd stopped letting myself want. I'm sorry about your grandmother, he said into my hair. I'm sorry she took that choice from you. I'm sorry you thought I'd seen it and didn't come. He pulled back just enough to look at me. We can't get the years back. No, I said, we can't. But I was still holding the letter, and he was still holding me, and the harbor was still holding the light the way it had always held everything, the promises and the losses and the long quiet years between them. Only now it was holding something else too, something that hadn't been there before, a beginning. The sun dropped below the horizon, and the water went from gold to silver, and Will leaned down and kissed me. It was not a kiss that asked a question. It was a kiss that answered one, the same one I'd been asking myself for 10 years without knowing it. Is it too late? And the answer was no. The answer was here, now, this, us. When we finally pulled apart, the first stars were coming out over the Sound. I could hear the tide pulling at the pilings beneath us, and somewhere behind me the market was still half-packed and waiting, and none of it mattered. What mattered was his hand in mine, and the letter folded in my pocket, and the quiet certainty that I had not walked away from something that mattered. I had walked toward it, finally. After 10 years, I had walked toward it. So, he said, and his voice was lighter now, the way it used to be when we were 27 and 26 and standing on this same pier in a different life. What do we do now? I looked at him. I looked at the water. I looked at the sky, which was still holding the last of the sunset like it couldn't bear to let it go. We start, I said. I used to think the silence between Will and me was a thing I had earned. 10 years of believing I wasn't worth an explanation. 10 years of building a quiet, contained life around a goodbye he never said. The letter in the attic taught me something I should have known all along. Sometimes the silence in our lives is not ours. Sometimes it has been arranged for us by people who loved us in the only way they knew how, and called that love. I learned something else, standing on the pier with his hand in mine, and the sky going dark above us. The years we lost are gone. We cannot get them back. But the years still in front of us belong to whoever has the courage to choose them. And I had spent a decade calling my contained life a choice when it was only a habit of grief. The beginning we made that evening was not the same as what we would have had at 27. It was something smaller and more honest, something we both had to walk toward. I keep thinking how often the people who love us most can quietly decide what we are allowed to know. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment with what it brought up for you. I publish a new story every few days, all of them quiet, honest, slow-burn romance. And if you want more stories like this one in book form, my novels are on Amazon under the name Isabelle Cross. Until next time, love, Isabelle.